Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another COM 107 Video Friday. And for the most part, this lecture day is a two-part lecture. The first is we're going to briefly look at the problem-solution dichotomy and sort of what that kind of binary means to really create or at least show individuals that a problem exists and that we want to do something about it, and how to argue on behalf of a solution that would say, hey, let's take an action to resolve the problems in which we have already isolated or at least listed off is kind of the basic format for what you want to do whenever you persuade another individual. The second part of the lecture is just going to be me showing off a bunch of different topic ideas that you can totally steal if you would like to and utilize for your own speech. If you already have kind of a persuasive idea and know what you want to do your topic about, you don't really need to pay attention to the second part of the video, and you can probably just turn it off then and save yourself some time. But if you have no idea what you want to do your speech on, maybe you could steal one of the ideas that I potentially have. So give me like 2 seconds to share my screen, and we will begin with the show. Okay, so the problem solution dichotomy is one in which we need to take the two parts of the process that we all know about and kind of put into a formulaic understanding about what to do in a speech. So the first thing is we're going to need a problem. A problem needs to be an area of a controversy. It needs to have some sort of dissent where two sides are going to be able to argue on behalf of a certain idea, goal, or kind of a resolutional state in which they can modify or change the status quo or the behaviors of the world, sometimes for their own personal gain, but sometimes for their own kind of mental image of how things could be or how things should be to create a better society and whatnot. And so when we have a controversy, there's room for dissent on both sides. There should be reasonable arguments produced by both sides. So if you say to yourself, I'm going to list a controversy that's very one-sided, that doesn't make for a good problem area because you're not really convincing individuals that, okay, maybe people stealing from the poor is bad. You're not going to hear many persuasive arguments that stealing from the poor is a good thing, unless somebody is probably morally bankrupt. And so when you get a good problem area, there needs to be at least that sort of like unclear haziness surrounding the controversy or the phenomena or the thing itself that really lets us say, okay, here is the path forward and here's how we move forward with it. And so when we have our problem and we're isolating our problem for our speech, there's two really models that you can kind of do. You can set up your speech in which you say, okay, I'm going to do my speech as in the first part of the speech is going to be proving that a problem exists in the world and that we should actually spend time thinking about it or spend time caring about it. Maybe if I'm making an argument about climate change, I'm showing evidence that climate change is going to be a problem in not only our life systems, but also our children's life systems, and maybe our children's might not get a life cycle because of climate change. And I can prove that through evidence. And that is an area in which I can start to insert some of the citations that I've had from my speech so that my audience members really can kind of say, okay, we need to actually take an action for what it is we are doing. Then the next thing we want to do is craft our solution. Our solution then gets put onto the back half of the speech and be like, okay, so here are some reasonable things that we could do, such as ratify the Paris Agreement. Maybe that is your solution to resolving the problem of climate change, or at least helping resolve the problem of climate change. Now, you need to make sure that when you put out a potential solution, whether it is a change of action, a change of behavior, or whatever it is, you need to also argue on behalf of why that solution actually resolves the problems that you listed in the first place. And why that's important for us is because if you spend a large time developing a big problem that exists in the world and you create like a very tiny solution, then that's not very persuasive to me, at least to say, okay, I'm going to be able to resolve all of this because, hey, you just told me that giant corporations are the direct reason in which the planet is ecologically or environmentally being screwed over. And then you told me that I need to start using reusable straws. That doesn't really resolve the heart of the problem in which you have isolated or listed. And so a good solution is one that directly speaks to kind of the problems that may come up when you are trying to persuade another individual so that you can say, okay, I'm already ahead of this kind of understanding. Or even if you don't have a solution that resolves all of the problems, problems, you can then use the language of, okay, maybe this potential solution leads to more forward thinking and more progress in the future. Maybe pressuring my senator to ratify the Paris Agreement, which we are now back into anyway, so this is irrelevant, is going to be fall on deaf ears, are totally going to be unnecessary, or maybe not even enough to really resolve the problem of climate change, but it at least puts pressure on the individuals and institutions that need it if we are going to create a more sustainable future for everyone to live in, blah, 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 so on and so forth. And so you can set up your speech where you can isolate that there is a problem, you have a potential plan of action to resolve it with a solution, and then argue on behalf of why that plan of action actually solves the problem which you have isolated for me early on in the speech. That is one way to do it. The second way in which you can do it is in the introduction. You can just spend all of your time isolating that there is a problem there, and then just talk about the solution the entirety of the speech for the entirety of the 6 minutes, particularly if it is a well-known problem. So climate change, for instance, is a good example of this. If your audience probably knows what climate change is and has already accepted that it is an inherent harm that we need to fix or kind of resolve for the most part. So if you're giving a speech to me, you probably don't need to spend a lot of time being like, Aaron, ocean acidification is a real problem for biodiversity loss and is going to kill us all. Yeah, I know that. And so you can then move into just talking about potential solutions that might be good for addressing the overarching original problem. Now, also in your persuasive speech, if you have many different solutions which you would like to argue on behalf of, you can totally do that for this speech. You don't have to isolate it in kind of a one-to-one. Aaron should care about the environment or Aaron doesn't care about the environment, but instead you could be like, here are a couple potential options that we have available to us. Doing that allows you to address the topic area from multiple sides and say, okay, well, you know what, now that I have this kind of a bunch of trendy solutions, I can then make my own kind of decision or my own delineation of kind of the choice that I want to take. And it's also good for you because it lets you talk a lot more about a lot of different things and really gets rid of a lot of the redundancies that may potentially happen if you go and take the approach of just a problem solution dichotomy or binary. If you are saying to yourself, okay, I'm getting very repetitive and saying the same thing over and over again, maybe I just look at it from different angles to address the overarching problem. And so with that said, that's kind of just a general overview that I at least wanted to address or talk about while you are starting to formulate your ideas for your persuasive speech. Now, I'm going to give a bunch of examples for problems that you may potentially want to argue on behalf of certain solutions. I might spend a lot of time on a couple of the slides, but really I'm just going to look at overarching topic areas or controversy areas where you could potentially find, or at least a home for yourself to be like, okay, this is interesting, or this area is interesting, and I can make some good arguments over here. You don't really have to worry about this too much. If it's an overdone speech topic, that'll be easier to give a speech on for the most part if you don't know what to do. But if you're persuasively trying to convince somebody that you want to change or modify their behavior and they hear it every day, it's very hard to be uniquely persuasive in that world. And so that's just something that you need to take into account, or at least a sort of nuanced understanding that you need to have before you go into the persuasive appeal. And the second is always going to be understanding the audience and what it is that they are willing to accept at that time period is also very pertinent for us to think about, particularly if you wanted to argue on behalf of a conspiracy theory, for instance, or something that is not generally accepted. You have to know within those constraints that you have to do a lot more work on identifying that the problem exists in the first place. And so that kind of changes the way in which you approach the speech topic. So you would spend a lot more time developing the language of the problem as opposed to the solution, because you have to prove that a problem actually exists in the first place. So the first area in which we could potentially give a speech on is this area of art and artistic modes of analysis and discourse. Art is very cool, but it's also very controversial. In the past, art's been used for things such as propaganda to justify demonization of particular populations in a very evil and negative light. It's also been an argument of debate for what is art. Do things such as graffiti or street art count as art in the first place? Is something that you might have. You might have that moment where you're sitting there thinking to yourself, okay, I wanted to go, well, here's an example or an anecdote on my behalf. I went out on a date once and the person got me to go to this postmodern art exhibit in this old abandoned warehouse factory, and I spent a good hour there watching somebody staple a Pabst can to a toilet seat. And I had a moment that was like sort of like an internalized existential crisis of like, what is art, and is something really happening here, or is this sort of a weird situation that I am totally not on enough drugs to be in? Are all sorts of conversations that we can have in this world of artwork. What kind of music, or what kind of let's say, what kind of message or argument does your favorite song make, and should we keep that into the back of our heads, or does visualizations or visuals need to be incorporated into textbooks and classes? Should we in high school sex education have anatomies of individuals put into the textbooks, or is that too much or too risque for certain individuals? There's a litany of things that we can do in the art world, such as music therapy, etc., and so forth. Now, the next topic area, it can be anything economic related. So you can make arguments on behalf of labor and the labor environments in which we live. Certainly, there are a lot of economic inequalities in the status quo that need to be resolved or could be resolved to create a better society that is more fair and just moving forward. Or maybe you think that we have a fair and just or the best system moving forward, and you see negative trends moving against it, and you want to argue on behalf of the status quo. These are all sorts of things that you should take into account, and you could do something along the lines of we should pay interns because free labor is still slave labor for the most part, or post-COVID economic recovery is going to be hard and very complicated, particularly with trends to certain industries cutting jobs that they're realizing that they don't need in the first place. And so there's no new jobs being created, particularly when things like technology comes in and I don't want to use the word steals, but replaces that form of kind of labor. And so, what do we do in a world where there's a lot of individuals without work, without pay, but we're still having the overpopulation of the world in which we have currently put ourselves into its own sort of problematic for its own like environmental scape? And if you wanted to do a speech on overpopulation, you could totally give me a speech on overpopulation if I have any aspiring Malthusians in here for the most part. Education's pretty cool too. We could have new anti-bullying protections and campaigns because that is certainly something that's not gone away. A lot of you are recently graduated from high school, and so this speech topic area is probably one of relative importance for a lot of individuals. So you probably know from an education standpoint a lot of problems you've seen and witnessed, and that sets a good basis for kind of talking about education generally speaking. Maybe you hated doing the SATs and you thought they were stupid because it was just regurgitation of information without actually proving something. And so you could argue to abolish the SATs, or maybe you think grades are stupid, or maybe learning cursive handwriting in elementary school. I don't know if people still do that. That was my least favorite thing of all time because I've literally used it 0 times outside of signing my name, which is just a bunch of squigglies anyway. Or maybe you don't like Greek life. You could do a bunch of different angles on how you want to approach the area of education and think it could be better than what it already is, because there are definitely problems with our educational system and the way in which it's set up. Maybe universities are too expensive. Maybe college debt is something that is too irresponsible or too not what good. It's not good for a reasonable society to have in the first place. Up next is something on the area of ethics. Any sort of ethical area always asks you to make strong validative claims. So maybe we can abolish the death penalty, or maybe we have stronger restrictions on guns. Maybe we do something like legalize prostitution. This fundamentally asks a question of what it means to be a person in doing the morally right thing and arguing on behalf of kind of that ideal or ideological kind of understanding of the world. Maybe we should have stronger penalties on DUIs, or maybe we should just fully declassify weed or remove weed from the extreme substance list in which it's already kind of classified as. And so these are different approaches that we can have, which allows us to say that our ethical dynamics or our kind of ethical orientations to the world could be modified in a way that is kind of good for other people to live their lives. Next up is a governmental perspective. We can argue on the governmentality of certain pieces of legislation or laws that could be modified or changed, which probably speaks to the politics of our time and is always going to be contemporary. You can make Puerto Rico a state, you can make DC a state, you can censor or decensor things that are in the internet, or you could look at anything that's even in the Biden agenda and argue for it or against it based upon current trends. That would be a very easy speech to do. And so when you look at the Biden agenda and you say to yourself, okay, these are the things that he is pushing for, like a large scale infrastructure package or something along those lines. How do we create or at least craft an infrastructure package in the United States that is going to be potentially a good thing to make sure that it has equal access to the funding, or there is good selection of which individuals are going to be the constructors of the projects themselves, is something that you could have a conversation about, or at least a speech topic about, and just making sure that it's not like narcissistically going to be kicked back into some like politicians' cousins fund that they're going to screw up. Could be a pretty cool speech. Next up is a speech on health. And so health in the United States could be a good controversial area. There's things such as mental health, which we certainly do not take good accounts for or good access to, or even have lines of accessibility for individuals to get the mental health care that they need. And we certainly don't have enough training for it. In a lot of ways, even in my job, for instance, I'll speak to a lot of students where I'm just like, I really wish that this student could get more mental health care, but I am not trained or qualified to even speak to it really in the first place, and I could do more harm than good. And so maybe we need better training for educators and teachers and other individuals that work with large scales amounts of individuals so that they can get better access to the things that they need. Or maybe we could do something such as resolve the healthcare crisis where there's millions of Americans that are currently uninsured and don't have the capacity to get good healthcare. There's a reason why there are a lot of poor and low income communities that tend to try to survive their problems as opposed to being proactive about their problems, because going to the hospital is still going to require you to spend a large chunk of your money. And so you might not go for a problem that you need to get resolved in the first place. Could be a speech, or you could give a speech from a doctor's perspective and just be like, preventative care and proactive care is always going to be way cheaper than trying to resolve problems after they happen in the forefront. Or you could get rid of sugary drinks or other things that are currently creating an obesity crisis, for instance, in the United States. Or maybe we should have better kind of mental or physical health care in schools, for instance, so that individuals can routinely craft a healthy diet or a healthy exercise for a healthy life. Up next is religion. Religion is kind of unique, and you can give a religious speech on kind of any of the angles that you want to take it. From something as basic as religious organizations should have to pay taxes if they make a certain amount of income, could be a very persuasive and easy speech to do, or things that we don't